Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W and our continuing discussion of American cultural history and culture in the era of Jim Crow. In this final lecture, we're going to talk about the rise of African American music and particularly that unique art form known as ragtime. While we tend to focus on jazz as a uniquely American musical form, before there was jazz, there was ragtime. And before there was ragtime, of course, there were other forms of African American music. These go all the way back to their origins on the plantations, and even further back to their origins in Africa. The slaves coming from Africa had a long tradition of playing their own kind of music, African drum beats in particular. And when they arrived on the plantations, they began to replicate those rhythms, inventing and creating their own musical instruments. They might replicate those beats and rhythms with spoons or coins or manufactured instruments that were made on the plantations. You see some of those handmade instruments on the screen. Some of the key ideas of syncopation and polyrhythm, which were the foundations of jazz that came later, originate with those African drum beats, polyrhythm, multiple rhythms going on at the same time, and syncopation, this idea of playing off of the beat or on the downbeat. Now there were other forms of music on the plantation as well, particular vocal music. Slaves frequently sang on the plantations, and there were several different variations on these ideas. There were slave spirituals and work songs, which were deeply emotional. In some cases, they were dedicated to the ideas of freedom and escape, or sorrow and suffering. Others called for revenge upon the master. These kinds of spirituals laid the foundation for a musical form that would come later, known as the blues. Another common form of music on the plantations was the field holler, in which there was a call and response from one slave calling to the others who would respond in unison. And we hear echoes of the field holler in later forms of music again, particularly in jazz and big band music, which we'll talk about later in the course. Now, one form of music that survived slavery and helped form the transition to the music of the early 20th century was the cakewalk. Slaves participated in these contests, known as cakewalks. They would mimic and exaggerate the particular gait or walk of their masters, and they were accompanied by music that had a particular kind of rhythm to them. They were sort of a march. The winner would get a cake, thus the cakewalk. Whites witnessed these spectacles, not realizing that in most cases the slaves were making fun of them, and they enjoyed the music and entertainment. This became a dance craze of the 1890s, and the music associated with the cakewalk became very popular. This was also one of the early roots of the minstrel shows and entertainment. Whites often picked up these activities and would perform in blackface, and there were also black performers in the minstrel shows as well. So the music that accompanied the cakewalk laid the early foundation for what would come next, which was ragtime, and in turn formed the foundation of jazz. In 1893, a young piano player named Scott Joplin heard some of the minstrels at the Chicago World's Fair. Minstrel songs were adapted around the turn of the century into the form known as ragtime. The heart of ragtime is syncopation, changing beats and emphasis, playing on the downbeat. Ragtime is derived from the phrase ragged time. Black composers and performers came to dominate ragtime and claim it as their own, but whites enjoyed it and supported it with their dollars. The king of ragtime was Scott Joplin. Born in 1868, he composed some 30 rags before his death in 1917. His death marks the end of the rag era and the transition into early jazz. Joplin began his career as a composer of marches and waltzes, but he was inspired by that music at the World's Fair in 1893. His popularity soared after that, and his career was made. His most popular composition until the 1973 movie The Sting was the Maple Leaf Rag, which was one of his first published pieces and was wildly popular. That 1973 movie brought to light another of his popular tunes called The Entertainer, which most of us would recognize instantly today. Ragtime was enormously popular in the era after the turn of the century. One aspect of its popularity were so-called rag contests. They would take a traditional piece of music and syncopate the rhythms to form a ragtime song. They would ragtime traditional marches and even classical compositions. Anything could be turned into ragtime. Now, those kinds of contests incorporated what would become one of the key elements of jazz, improvisation. Several artists helped to mark the transition from ragtime to jazz, which is somewhat difficult to define. But the end of ragtime is easier to mark than the beginning of jazz, the death of Scott Joplin. By the time of his death, ragtime was becoming less popular. The end of ragtime and the rise of jazz leads us into the next era, the 1920s, one of which the nicknames is the Jazz Age. And so in our next few lectures, we'll talk about the rise of jazz music and the popular culture of the 1920s.